I'm starting to feel old. I didn't know this song. Kings and Queens, I hadn't heard it before. I didn't even know the band 30 Seconds to Mars until Pete had given me the list of songs that the band was planning for this current Jesus Radio Superstar series, and this has been a bit of an education for me. I'm learning what the kids are listening to, or at least the new stuff. My daughters, they like Adele, the Beatles, and the Hamilton soundtrack, but this was a song I didn't know about. And I have to admit, this song, Kings and Queens, a theme didn't readily appear when I read the music or listened to the music, and I had to go searching around for one. So when I began to reflect on the words and try to figure out what this song was about, what Tiffany actually had in mind, great job today, though, by the way, Tiffany. The chorus jumped out at me, said, "We were the kings and queens of promise, we were the victims of ourselves, maybe the children of a lesser God between heaven and hell." And I began to wonder if that's how the children of Israel, how they felt for much of their history. Because they were kings and queens of promise, meaning that they were set apart to bless the world. God had chosen them, which meant that they were a chosen people, to be a light in the world to every nation. And this wasn't special spiritual status where they were a favored nation, where they'd go to heaven when they died, everyone else went somewhere else. But they were chosen to light up the night with God's love, when the night threatened to cover the whole world and into the day. But they were also so achingly human. They struggled with faithfulness. They often resisted God's call on their lives. They had trouble living into the chosenness that they were given. And they were often persecuted. They spent much of their history enslaved and forced to worship those lesser gods that they believed to be idols, but the gods who held such charm over them. But even more than that, they were a people always looking for a home, a place that was truly theirs, where they could be a people united in faith and in purpose. But they kept getting in their own way. King Manasseh is a great example of this. Manasseh's dad was Hezekiah, who ruled the northern kingdom of Judah through great prosperity. He strengthened the nation's place in the region, and he ushered in a religious awakening, returning to the practices and beliefs of their ancestors when the people turned to the empty promises and the allure of false or lesser gods. Manasseh reversed everything that his dad had accomplished. It was like he was saying that the old man had no idea what he was doing and that he was going to modernize everything. And he started early. Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign. He reigned for 55 years in Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the abominable practices of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. And what were those abominable practices? Well, the chronicler who wrote the books of Chronicles, who goes on to say this: "For he rebuilt the high places that his father Hezekiah had pulled down, and he erected altars to the Baals or the other gods, made sacred poles, and worshipped all the hosts of heaven," meaning all the gods they believed existed, and he served them. Because one of the key achievements of his father's reign was a return to the practices and the beliefs of the people who came before them. God put Hezekiah on the throne to deal with a problem. People were mixing pagan philosophies and practices with the faith of their fathers and their mothers. And because the people were worshiping idols, the people found themselves in danger of being destroyed by the Assyrian Empire, who was looking to expand their borders. And Israel and Judah were already losing territory. And they interpreted that loss as a punishment for being unfaithful to God and the faith of their forebears. So Hezekiah came in. He pushed back the Assyrians, rebuilt the kingdom based on the principles of the faith of the God of Israel. But what Hezekiah built up, Manasseh tore down, and he did so gleefully. Hezekiah was hard, but he was fair. He was no one's best friend, but he got the job done. He served the people faithfully and led them to return to their core values of faithfulness to the God of Israel, and he created a stable peace and prosperity that the people had longed for. Manasseh, well, he was just hard. He executed the prophets who dared speak against his excesses and his abuses. And he tore down and rebuilt the kingdom in direct contrast to what his dad had accomplished. He allowed and even welcomed pagan temples and shrines to be reestablished in the kingdoms. And he did this so he could tax them and then receive profit off of them. This wasn't a case of progressive pluralism in action. This was naked greed, getting rich off of people's religious impulses and their curious superstitions in direct defiance of the God he was called to serve. Manasseh opened trade routes. He revived Judah's rural economy through the growing demand for olive oil. But that economic growth came with religious compromises and national sellouts that amounted to apostasy or religious betrayal, according to the account in the second book of Kings. Whatever Manasseh accomplished for Judah, it always came with a cost, whether it be a compromise to national identity or an abandonment of their religious commitment to the God of Israel. Manasseh's rule over the kingdom of Judah threatened to turn his people into who they did not want to become, and certainly not who God wanted them to be. And the chronicler who's telling this story is not at all pleased with what Manasseh has done. He says, Manasseh misled Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that they did more evil than the nations whom God had destroyed before the people of Israel. So this king was doing the opposite of what God wanted. This king put the world in chaos, and Manasseh seemed to revel in the national pandemonium that he had created. And the song says this: the age of man is over, a darkness comes at dawn. These lessons that we have learned here have only just begun. And learn those lessons they would, the hard way, because God finally had enough. The Lord spoke to Manasseh and his people, but they gave no heed. Therefore the Lord brought against them the commanders of the army of the king of Assyria, who took Manasseh captive in manacles, bound him in fetters, and brought him to Babylon. While he was in distress, he entreated the favor of the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his ancestors. He prayed to him, and God received his entreaty, heard his plea, and restored him again to Jerusalem and to his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord indeed was God. Again, Assyria was called in to do God's dirty work. Manasseh's reign is over. He appears in front of the Assyrian king in chains. The people are enslaved once again. All that had been accomplished has been destroyed. And then the song says this: we were the kings and queens of promise. We were the victims of ourselves. Maybe the children of a lesser God between heaven and hell. They were the kings and queens that fell victim to themselves, unappreciative of the work of those who came before them, and uncaring about the life that they were leaving for their children. Theirs was counterfeit joy and false delight. Their moments of happiness and pleasure wouldn't last because it focused only on themselves, and they took no heed to those around them. They abandoned everything they said they believed in. And they were just following their leader, who by his own actions gave the people tacit permission to live according to their own selfish appetites, neglecting their role as God's chosen people among the nations. Manasseh was strong, yes, but he lacked vision beyond his own ego and ambition. His reign was long, but it couldn't endure because it would lack the internal cohesion to build something that would last beyond him. He may have been a king, but he lacked the humility to know that leadership is about serving those under his care, not for profiting off of them. He was a king without wisdom, who felt no need to acquire it. He was a ruler without insight, who had no compulsion to self-reflect on where he was leading his people. He was a sovereign who served only himself. Manasseh would have wanted to be remembered for his greatness as a king, but his self-obsessed greed that brought him down, and it brought down a kingdom, is that what he's now known for. So God stepped in, sent the Assyrian army, and everything fell apart. Maybe it took tremendous loss for them to see the path that they were on led to their destruction, rather than to their greatness. Maybe it took them standing among the rubble of everything they built and seeing their king humiliated, for the people to see that their way forward is markedly different from the path that brought them to the place that they now stood. They saw the end of their kingdom, and it made them wonder if their years of self-serving living was worth the devastation that they now faced. Could there be another way forward? This past week when I was writing the first draft, I received the absolutely heartbreaking news that a friend and colleague had died in her sleep. She went to bed on Monday night and didn't wake up Tuesday morning, 49 years old. She had just received a call to a new church, Trinity Lutheran Church in Warrenville, Illinois, and started her new position on September the 1st. She was to be installed next week. And she was so excited about this new opportunity. And I was genuinely excited for her. The joy on her face and the pictures she took with her new congregation, this absolutely just radiated. When someone dies, we tend to focus on the person's good qualities. We say how kind they were, or generous, or loving. And sometimes those features of a person's life might be exaggerated in the moment when weighed against the loss of that person in our lives. But people would say those things about Megan while she was still alive. She was always a bringer of light and delight. She had a way of creating joy. She was one of those exuberant personalities that made you feel like you were special because she believed that you were. She helped people see the goodness and beauty in themselves, qualities that many people are blind to. And people gravitated to her because they could sense that they could be real with her. She had a gift of bringing hurting people back to the church, especially those who had been damaged by uncaring institutional religion. And her Facebook page has become a shrine of sorts, where people share their feelings of heartbreak and of gratitude. And they're sharing their stories of how Megan impacted their lives. She was the opposite of Manasseh. She was the queen of promise that lived up to that title. I mention her today because there are moments when I need to remind myself that beautiful people still exist. During those times when I worry about the temptation of our broader culture to follow Manasseh's lead, where service to self is esteemed and compassion is dismissed as weakness, where fear is stoked and kindness is mocked, where prosperity is measured solely by economic growth and other indicators of growth such as community and contribution are either written off or downgraded as less important to financial success. Those times when I worry about a me-first mentality that appears to be growing, as if other people are impediments to growth and well-being. And it got me thinking, why live like that? Is that the best way for human beings to get along? Is that how God is calling us to live, especially when life is so short and memory can be so long? Why live selfishly when you can live generously? Why live pushing people away when you can live bringing people together? Why live with cruelty and indifference when you can live with kindness and concern? Why live in fear and in anger when you can live with hope and expectation? Why live with arrogance that alienates you from others when you can live with humility that connects you with others? Why live turning away people in need when you can live turning towards them? Why live tearing people down when you can live building people up? Why live carrying that grudge that's eating you out from the inside out when you can live in the freedom of forgiveness? Why live with malice and spite when you can live with compassion and concern? Why live like Manasseh when you can live like Megan? Because that's the kingdom that endures and leaves a legacy. That's the kingdom in which people thrive and receive the abundant life that God promises and that people yearn for. You are the kings and queens of promise. What kingdoms are you building? The song says, we were the kings and queens of promise. We were the victims of ourselves, maybe children of a lesser God between heaven and hell. The song seems to be warning us about not falling victim to ourselves. Then it says, we are the kings, we are the queens, we are the kings, we are the queens. And in this section, I'm not sure what he's saying. I'm not sure if the song is resigning us to our fate, saying that we are kings and queens that do fall victim to ourselves, or if it's saying that we are not, that we can escape or even transcend our previous condition. I hope it's the latter, because I hope this song isn't suggesting that we're irretrievably lost into selfish nihilism. Because I hope this song isn't describing who we are and who we will be, because that doesn't fully describe either us as a church or us sharing a common humanity with others on this planet. While it's easy to fall into despairing pessimism about the state of humanity, God has a different vision. Because we serve a God of transformation, where even a loathsome leader like Manasseh can change. Because as we heard earlier, Manasseh was restored to the throne, but he was a changed man. He was humbled, but renewed. He found his faith in the God of Israel and lived out the rest of his days smaller, but stronger. Rather than great and mighty, he was faithful. In fact, he found his greatness in his faithfulness to his people and to the God he was called to worship and to serve. He finally became a king of promise. What about you? You are kings and queens of promise, but what kingdoms are you building? When I think about it, I don't just have to remember my friend Megan and her legacy to remember that beautiful people still exist. All I have to do is look out at this gathering of God's people and know and see that beautiful people still exist. When I look out at this congregation, I see a people, kings and queens of promise, who are committed to building kingdoms of compassion, kingdoms of forgiveness, kingdoms of kindness, kingdoms of welcome, and kingdoms of hope. That's because you are citizens of the kingdom of God, and you are living, breathing, walking, talking embodiments of the God of love, whose crucified and risen Son has chosen you to be a blessing and has made you kings and queens of promise. Because that's who God has created and recreated you as you died and rose again in the waters of baptism. And God has declared you to be kings and queens of promise. The promise of forgiveness, the promise of peace, the promise of compassion, the promise of kindness, the promise of new and everlasting life. Because that is who you are, and that is who you are becoming, just as God has promised. May this be so among us. Amen.